Hi there, Lindsey Sparks here with the next episode of Read by the Author. Today we continue Echo in Time, the first book in the Echo Trilogy, read by the author, which is me, Lindsey Sparks. And now, let's return to the story. Chapter 21, Hello and Goodbye. The 2-hour trip back to the Haru compound on Bainbridge Island had been torturous, as was the walk through the house and up the stairs to my suite, where I knew Marcus awaited me. Dominic was by my side as usual, while Neffy kept pace on my left. Volley led our silent procession, and Sandra brought up the rear. Even with all the people around me, I felt completely alone. Volley pushed through the door to my sitting room, and I waited the usual 30 seconds for the all clear, a four-toned whistle. It put a serious dent in my day when I had to wait for my guards to search and approve every room I intended to enter. I missed being a nobody. I missed being able to relax, drink wine, eat cheese and popcorn, and watch comic book movies with Kara and Annie. Not like that'll ever happen again, I thought bitterly. Volley whistled. I took a deep breath, then another, and walked through the doorway. Marcus stood at the center window on the opposite side of the room, looking down on the immaculately manicured grounds. He was a king surveying his realm, a god observing his creation. At the sight of him in his impeccable charcoal suit, my chest exploded with joy. He clashed with the sitting room's warm decor. Soft greens, oranges, and creams accented the oak furniture and papered the walls. I loved my rooms, felt comfortable in them, and Marcus didn't seem to belong. I didn't like that. "Leave us," he ordered quietly. Volley looked to me and, at my nod, ushered everyone back to the hallway. Everyone except Dominic, who refused to leave. Dominic had become extremely attached to me, as I had become to him. His constant presence soothed me when little else would ease my perpetual heartache. He would tell me stories of his early childhood in the Loire Valley, of his many exciting adventures across Europe over the centuries, and what it was like to watch the world change around him while he remained, more or less, the same. I touched his arm, saying, "Dom, I'll be fine. He won't hurt me." Dominic peered down at me with sad eyes. "He already has," he said softly, though the glare he shot Marcus was diamond hard. Marcus watched Dominic leave, irritation tightening the skin around his eyes. "You two seem to have become quite close," he observed. I marched between a pale green sofa and a glass-topped coffee table straight toward Marcus and slapped his perfect face as hard as I could. "Ow!" I howled immediately after, shaking my stinging palm. He didn't even have the decency to pretend it had hurt. "You are such an asshole, Haru," I screeched, hitting him in the chest with my open hands. "And an idiot," I hit him again, "and a coward," again, and a... He reached up and caught my wrists in an iron grip. "I've been called many things, little Ivanov, but never a coward, and I'd appreciate it if you wouldn't use that name." "What name?" I spat. His hold on me was unbreakable. No matter how hard I tugged, I couldn't pull my wrists free. "Haru," he said with disgust. That caught me off guard, and I stopped struggling. "But it's your name. You made that very clear the last time I saw you." I didn't tell him that. To me, he would always be Marcus. His tiger eyes flashed with anger. "I told you once before that I preferred for you to call me Marcus. That preference hasn't changed." I raised my eyebrows. "What? So everyone else can call you by your real name, but I get stuck with your most recent pseudonym?" His grip tightened, and he raked his eyes over my face, shoulders, and chest. The anger lighting his gaze transformed into heat of another kind. Desire. I didn't know what he found so exciting, dressed as I was in a cream silk blouse and tailored black blazer. "I have no desire for everyone else to see me as I would have you see me." "And that would be as what?" I fumed. He answered without hesitation.
The first thing you think of upon waking, and the last upon falling asleep. The man you call out to in times of unbearable pain and desperate pleasure. And the man who will do anything to keep you alive," he professed, his black-rimmed gold eyes burning through my anger.
"Oh," I said softly.
"I tried for 2 months, but I had to return," he said, sounding desperate.
Marcus was evidently unused to being ruled by emotion. How had I sauntered into his world and ripped apart his rigid control and unfailing logic? What made me so special? I honestly didn't understand why I had such an effect on him, but I was glad I did. "Heru will set his heart on her," I said quietly, quoting Nguyen's prophecy. Marcus released me, bowing his head and turning away to face the window once more.
"So they told you. I made them swear not to. Who disobeyed me?"
"Does it really matter? If they did it for me, the person responsible is sworn to me now, not just you," I reminded him, hoping to spare Nephi whatever punishment her father might want to dole out.
Grudgingly, Marcus said, "Fine, it is done."
I hesitated, then spoke, picking my words carefully. "I understand why you left, Marcus. I really do. It was a clever idea. Idiotic, but clever."
"What are you saying?" he asked, his voice rough.
He continued to stare out the window. "Just that I understand why you did it, why you tried to work around Nguyen's prophecy. But you need to understand something." I glared at the back of his head. "You hurt me." At my words, or maybe at the harsh anger laced through them, he bowed his head lower. "The way you spoke to me in front of the others," I continued, "and then you left, and it felt like you took a part of me with you, an essential part." Without warning, he turned and knelt before me. I said nothing, unable to form any sounds when faced with such a proud man kneeling at my feet. I desperately wanted to touch him, and I had to consciously stop my hands from reaching out. Holding my gaze with eyes blazing like golden suns, Marcus spoke.
"I live to serve, Meswet. My life is yours, Meswet. May you live forever."
I inhaled sharply. I'd heard those words dozens of times from all my guards and had accepted every offering, but hearing them from Marcus disgusted me. Falling to my knees, I stared at him. His eyes were liquid, molten, and challenging. "I do not accept your service or your life, Nezharet. I refuse to be the Meswet to you." He gazed at me, an unfathomable mixture of emotions altering his expression, widening his eyes, tensing his jaw, parting his lips. Heat and desire burned in his eyes, and I thought he might ravish me right then and there. I wanted him to. I wanted an excuse to experience every carnal thing he had learned in his thousands of years, and beyond that, to be as close to him as possible, both physically and emotionally. Desperately, I wanted him to take the decision out of my hands, but Marcus was a master of control and desire, and anticipation. He rose and moved away so quickly that I almost fell forward. When I regained my balance, he was once again staring out the window. Holding my head high, I stood, but didn't approach him. "Why return now?" I asked. "Why did losing the trial bring you back to me?" Fists clenching, he explained.
"That little piece of shit had his hands all over you. He had his tongue shoved in your mouth, his hand up your skirt. I can't stand the idea of him getting near you again. Just knowing he has those memories, that he can recall the feel of your most intimate parts at will, makes me want to rip out his throat." He paused, then added, "Which I may still do." I approached him cautiously, hoping to avoid triggering the rage that boiled just beneath his surface. Gently touching his shoulder, I swallowed my pride and said, "Marcus, I'm glad you're back." Marcus sighed, regaining his control. "As am I."
I let my hand slip down his arm and rest in the crook of his elbow. "Come on, There's a huge banquet downstairs to celebrate the end of the trial. I think they're all just happy we don't have to go out in public en masse for a while. We really do draw the attention of the humans. They must think we're a pack of day-walking vampires or something." Shaking his head, Marcus almost smiled. "Yes, I'll come down to your little feast. I have news to share with everyone. Besides," he gazed down at me in a way that made me want to melt into his arms, "I'll use any excuse to touch you for a few more minutes." He was studying me intently. "You've changed," he said, a note of sadness in his voice. "Not where it matters," I told him softly, earning a faint smile. Arms linked, we made our way downstairs, acquiring Volley and 2 more bodyguards along the way. When we entered the dining hall, what could easily have been classified as the most tasteful of ballrooms, the Negerettes filling it slowly fell into an eerie hush. Marcus gazed around the room, his expression haughty. He was Heru, the falcon god, patriarch of one of the most powerful Negerette familial lines. When he entered any room, he commanded the attention of everyone present, and like a celestial body, his gravitational pull required everyone to remain aware of him hours later. Over 100 pairs of Negerette eyes were locked on him, riveted. Releasing his arm, I stepped back a few paces. "My family and friends, I greet you, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart." He touched his right hand to his chest. "For taking such good care of the Meswet in my absence. I assure you, it is my intention to never leave her side again." Echoing the emotion in my chest, an enthusiastic cheer roared throughout the room for a few moments. They all knew the prophecy, and they knew what it meant for Marcus to make such a claim. "I have news to share with all of you. My time away was split between Kemet and Firenze," he stated, earning hushed speculation from nearly everyone. That he had spent time in Kemet, the ancient name for Egypt, indicated he'd been doing something related to the upcoming excavation. Firenze, Florence, Italy, I'd recently learned, was the auspicious location of Ivan's headquarters and therefore the international center for his familial line, for my ancestral line. Was Marcus visiting Ivan? "I met with many officials in our ancient homeland," Marcus continued, "and am pleased to announce that the excavation has been moved up. We will depart on the 22nd of March. I glanced at Dominic and Neffy just in time to see them exchange a look of shared angst and frustration. Everything from the field school participants to the housing and travel arrangements was set up for a departure date roughly 2 months later than the one just announced. Marcus, who didn't care to dirty himself with such menial tasks, would no doubt leave the tireless job of logistical rearrangement to Dominic and Neffy. They were going to be a joy to work with for the next week. "My second piece of news," Marcus said to the quieting crowd, "regards the most recent unpleasantness. The 6 remaining members of the Council of 7 have met to pass sentence on the Set cult member, Mike Hernandez. As you can all imagine, Ivan was quite distraught about the human's actions toward the Meswet, his great-granddaughter. He felt the human justice system would likely fail our most important sister in her time of need. In anticipation of their failure, we found him guilty and sentenced him. 'The tyranny of the council and their false prophecy will end with the Meswet's death,' a man shouted from the back of the room. Gasps erupted throughout the cavernous space as men and women turned to search the back of the dining hall for the speaker. Marcus's body slammed into mine, knocking me to the marble floor, just as 3 explosive cracks sounded in quick succession. I lay on my back, something warm and wet spreading across my torso. Is it blood? Am I bleeding? Marcus's ashen face was inches from mine, his black pupils constricting until his eyes were more golden than I had ever seen them. "I've got him!" a woman shouted in the erupting cacophony. She sounded distant and hollow, like she was speaking through a tin can phone. "Will you accept my life now, little Ivanov?" Marcus rasped through blood-stained lips. "I give it to you, gladly." He rested his head on my shoulder and fell still. No, I shrieked. No, I won't accept it. I don't want it. No, take it back, I shouted, repeating variations of the same words over and over again. Why didn't I tell him how I felt? Why am I so stubborn? I'm always so stupidly stubborn. Is he dying? Is he dead? No. Hands were on me, gentle and firm, and 4 pairs of concerned eyes stared down at me from familiar faces. Alive faces, but none of them was the right face. Why wasn't Marcus looking at me the way they were? Why wasn't he looking at me at all? Why was he just lying on top of me, unmoving? Dominic asked me something, but his words didn't make any sense. They were meaningless. Everything was meaningless without him. Why isn't he moving? At my blank stare, Dominic growled. Was she hit? Nevi, did any bullets hit her? I don't know. There's so much blood. I think it's all from my father. We need to move him, she replied. Now! Marcus's body was rolled off mine, and Nefi's precise hands began examining every inch of my body. I stared at Marcus's blood-smeared face, at his vacant eyes, while Nefi searched me for bullet holes that weren't there. She was focusing on the wrong body. She needed to be working on him. A realization that snapped me out of my shock. I pushed her hands away. I'm fine. Help him. Help him. If he dies. Somehow Nefi read the desperation in my eyes, the desperation verging on insanity. Her resolve hardened, and she spun on her knees. Volley, pick him up, carefully, she ordered, pressing a wad of cloth napkins against her father's punctured, bleeding chest while the huge blond man lifted him off the floor. I followed as they took Marcus's body to a nearby room, one I had yet to explore. I was surprised to find a well-stocked home clinic. I might have wondered what the hell it was doing in the main house of the Haru compound, but all I could think about was Marcus. He can't die. He's lived for thousands of years. He can't die. Carlyle, find the 3 oldest Negerettes here and begin drawing their blood, Nefi ordered. We need to transfuse. Take mine, please, I begged. Quietly, Dominic explained. His body needs stronger blood. More mature blood. The older the Negerette, the more developed their regenerative abilities. I'm sorry, Lex, but you can't help him. Until Dominic spoke, I hadn't noticed his arm around my waist, keeping me standing. Don't we need a doctor? I asked, watching Nefi cut off her father's shirt. Nefi has more medical degrees than any other living being, Negerette or otherwise. She is the best, Dominic informed me. I watched Carlyle herd in his 3 chosen ancient blood donors, one of which was Sandra. I hadn't known she was among the oldest of Marcus's line. What about their blood types? What if they have the wrong kind? I asked, panic and fear thick in my voice. We might kill him. Start the transfusion, Nefi told another Negerette I didn't recognize. He's AB positive, a universal receiver, she explained as she cut an impossibly deep incision down the center of Marcus's chest. Blood, thick and incredibly dark, welled up and over the edges of the incision, and not once did Marcus flinch. Because Marcus was dead. Dun dun dun! Whew, that was intense. 22. Age and Wisdom. Nefi revived Marcus 3 times before he finally stabilized. One of the bullets had pierced his heart, the other 2 his left lung. It had taken her 15 minutes to repair the wounds, enough that his vital organs would mend themselves properly. Once she had cracked his sternum open, I had to look away. He'll live, I'm positive, Nefi told me as she shamelessly peeled off her body. She shamelessly peeled off her body. Nefi told me as she shamelessly peeled off her bloody clothes in the center of the home clinic. I hit Dominic's arm with the back of my hand for his equally shameless ogling. What? I've seen it all before, several times, he replied, his thin lips curling up into a sly, closed-mouthed smile. Nefi rolled her eyes and shrugged. Sometimes I get lonely. She motioned for me to follow her into the attached bathroom, where she stepped into the shower. Marcus's blood was all over her, even in her hair. I, on the other hand, only had it on my shirt. Shutting the door, I asked, "So what happens now?" I hopped up and perched beside the sink on the white tile counter. From beyond a fogged glass door, Nephi explained, "Now he regenerates. It could take him up to 24 hours to heal enough to regain consciousness. All of his body's energy is currently going toward repairing his vital organs. We'll move him up to his suite, and if you like, you can stay with him there. I just assumed that once you returned, the two of you would start sharing a bed." "Nephi, he's your dad," I exclaimed. "How can you even think about that?" She laughed, and the sound reverberated in the increasingly steamy, confined space. "You should ask around about his reputation." She paused. "Actually, maybe you shouldn't. Anyway, he'll look different for a while, noticeably thinner and possibly sickly or older. His body will be focused entirely on healing what it needs to survive, not on remaining young or robust," she explained. "But don't worry, he'll be the old Haru, Marcus, in no time. One of the perks of being so ridiculously ancient." After my mini coma, I had lost weight and appeared sickly, and I'd only been out for a handful of hours. Marcus, on the other hand, had actually died several times. How different will he look? After listening to the shower run for a long moment, I asked the question that had been troubling me since I became certain of Marcus's recovery. "Nephi, what about the guy who shot him?" "Ah, yes. He is, by his own stupid announcement, guilty of attempting to assassinate the Meswet and nearly murdering a member of the Council of Seven. We don't kill our kind easily, but he'll be executed. After he's interrogated, of course. We must discover the other traitors behind the attack. Do you approve?" "Yes," I hissed, surprised by the venom the single word could contain. I wanted to tear the shooter apart with my bare hands. "Wonderful," Nephi said, shutting off the water and stepping out of the shower. I tried to ignore her perfect, curvaceous body while she toweled off, but it wasn't easy. I frowned, knowing I would never have curves like hers. Unhurried, Nephi slipped into a soft white robe. "Now, I have many things to do for the excavation if we truly are to leave next Friday. You should go upstairs and change, then go to my father. Sit with him. Your presence will bring him comfort." I did as she suggested, winding my way through the hallways, stairwells, and corridors, Volley leading and Sandra trailing behind me. I stopped by my own rooms just long enough to exchange my bloody silk blouse for a plain black t-shirt and to wipe the crusted blood off my stomach before heading to the suite next door, Marcus's suite. The two guards at the door instantly let me inside, offering supportive smiles. Thanking them, I slipped through Marcus's sitting room without a single glance around me. I needed to see Marcus, not what he owned. But holy crap, I was terrified. Will I even recognize him? "How is he?" I asked Dominic, who was standing in the doorway between the sitting room and the bedroom. "He's healing," my half-brother said, giving my shoulder a squeeze. Did Nephi explain that he would look different for a little while?" "Yeah. Thanks, by the way, for everything you did. I probably would have collapsed if you hadn't kept me standing." Dominic lifted his hand and, with gentle fingers, tilted my face up so he could see it better. "It was nothing." A faint smile softened his sharp, pale features. "Someday I'll tell you of our father. I'll tell you of his treatment of my mother and of me. Then I think you'll understand why I would do anything for you, the one prophesied to cause his destruction." "Or the world's." Dominic's eyes shone with unshed tears, but before I could voice my doubts, he dropped his hand and said, "I'll leave you two to your happy reunion." He left me in the doorway and sat in the furthest armchair. With an apprehensive sigh, I walked into Marcus's bedroom. It took me several breaths to fully comprehend that the middle-aged man lying under the covers in the enormous four-poster bed was Marcus. As I approached the bed, I took note of all the little changes to his face. His hair was salt and pepper instead of jet black, and there were faint wrinkles on his brow, at the corners of his eyes, and around his mouth. Some of the precision of his bone structure had been softened. So, author's note, along with Oded Fair, I also totally kind of saw not super old, but in that one episode of Stargate when Apophis, when Apophis's host is, I can't remember if Apophis was no longer in him or what was going on, but the one when his host starts aging suddenly for some reason, whatever the reason was, I can't remember. Anyway, that's also what I picture. Sorry, side note. Stargate side note. Ha! Anyway, Stargate spoilers. His hair was salt and pepper instead of jet black, and there were faint wrinkles on his brow and at the corners of his eyes and around his mouth. Some of the precision of his bone structure had been softened. I let out a shaky laugh, thinking it was so typical of Marcus that he would look like a dapper older gentleman instead of someone suffering from a chronic illness, which had been my body's reaction to using regeneration to heal. I grasped his nearest hand, wrapping both of mine around it. "I will never accept your life in exchange for mine," I whispered vehemently. "Do you understand me, Marcus? I refuse to live in a world where you don't exist." I laid my forehead on the bed between my arms. To an observer, I probably looked like a woman deep in prayer. If I were, it was to a very old, very proud man who had once been considered a god. There, lying in supplication to Marcus or Heru, whoever he was, I fell asleep. Thankfully, I didn't dream. "Wake up, little Ivanov," murmured a quiet, masculine voice. It was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. The hand I'd been holding when I had fallen asleep was gone from my grasp. Instead, his fingers were gently stroking my mess of mahogany hair. I smiled into the comforter before raising my head. Though he was still the middle-aged version of himself, the sight that greeted me was breathtaking. Marcus was awake, smiling, alive. "Come here," he said softly, patting the comforter on the opposite side of his body. I yearned to cuddle with him, to feel his warm, solid body next to mine, but I shook my head. "I don't want to hurt you." "Come here," he repeated, demanding. I bit my lower lip in hesitation, but the yearning in his eyes won me over. I walked around the bed and carefully slid closer to him. "I'll recover, Lex," he murmured, and a rush of relief filled my chest. Part of me hadn't believed that he really was okay until that moment. I curled up against him and, voice wobbly, said, "I'm counting on it." He sighed and tightened his arm around my waist. I breathed in, eager for his spicy scent, but I was disappointed. "Why do you smell different? I mean, you don't smell bad, just different." His thumb began caressing my ribs as he spoke. "Well, as far as I could tell, I was shot in the heart. Am I correct?" I nodded against his shoulder, attempting to keep my breathing steady. The skin he was stroking burned with a pleasant fire. "Then I must have been given blood from another Nezeret, possibly several. Until my own blood cells replace it, I'll smell a little bit like each of them. You're developing heightened senses rapidly, little Ivanov, if you could smell the difference. Did you know that in the most powerful of us, our sensation of touch is heightened as well? I am one of those. Are you?" He chuckled as his thumb continued its gentle stroking. "Marcus," I finally growled between uneven breaths. It just so happened that all of my senses had been slowly becoming more sensitive, including touch. "Ah, very well," Marcus said, ceasing his tactile ministrations. Lightly he pressed his lips to my forehead, the hint of his stubble a pleasant scratchiness. "Pardon the interruption, Meswet," Carlyle said from the doorway. "But Heru really should eat now that he's awake. It'll hasten his healing process.
There's a tray of food for you as well in the sitting room, he said as he wheeled in a multi-level food cart heaped with a variety of dishes. Sitting up, I gaped. That's all for him? Regeneration brings on a hearty appetite, was Carlyle's response. It made sense. I recalled my own increased appetite after waking from the coma. Why is my food out there? I pointed my thumb over my shoulder toward the sitting room. I'll eat in here with him. Messwet, I'm not sure you want to watch him eating just yet. After recovery from such a fatal injury, the first few meals can be unpleasant, Carlyle warned. I tried to picture polite and proper Marcus shoving handfuls of food into his mouth, but couldn't. I clenched my teeth and stated, I'm staying. Lex, Marcus said, his voice laden with warning. Marcus? He sighed at my mulishness and followed up with a groan as Carlyle rearranged pillows and propped him up into a sitting position. If you let me eat my first 5 meals alone, I'll tell you the truth behind the contendings of Heru and Set myth. A glimpse into Marcus's past, a chance to see the man who had inspired one of the most famous Egyptian myths, was almost too much to pass up. Almost. 3, I countered. He narrowed his eyes. 5. 4. 5. I snorted in exasperation. Fine, 5 meals. But you'd better let me know as soon as he finishes, I told Carlyle. I really didn't want to leave Marcus's side, but I didn't want to make him uncomfortable either. Of course, Messwet, Carlyle said with a bow and minutely shaking shoulders. I was pretty sure he was laughing at me. I left the bedroom and quickly ate my own food, lemon and herb roasted chicken, mashed potatoes and gravy, and glazed heirloom carrots, paired with a small carafe of a light white wine. At a small granite-topped dining table set in front of a picture window, staring out at the tree-lined horizon, I sighed. He really is okay. Daydreaming? Dominic asked in his smooth French accent. I'd been so lost in thought I hadn't heard him enter the room. Sort of, I said, turning to look at him. He was sitting in an oversized steel gray armchair on the opposite side of the room. His chin-length, nearly black hair was slicked back as usual, but it looked wet. I figured he'd taken a break from chaperoning me to get cleaned up. Last I had seen him, his clothes had been stained with nearly as much blood as mine had been, but his current attire, black-on-black pinstriped suit pants and a midnight blue dress shirt, was immaculate. You're very sneaky, you know. Amusement touched his handsome features, curving his thin lips and making his coal-black eyes sparkle. Precisely the reason your Marcus frequently employs me as a spy, he told me, and I prefer the term stealthy. All right, stealthy, I agreed. For the first time, I had a chance to examine the decor in Marcus's personal space. His house in Ravenna had been decorated generically, reflecting none of his actual taste, but his sitting room screamed Marcus as loudly as if he'd stamped his name on every chair, table, and trinket in bold, garish letters. Gray and black, the 2 colors that dominated his wardrobe, seemed to govern his home decor tastes as well. Every piece of furniture was sleek and elegant, somehow managing a level of subtle sensuality. Strewn about the room on shelves and tables were little bits of bright blue, orange, red, and violet, all in the form of priceless antiques. And they weren't corner shop in a quaint town antiques, but $1,000,000 personal invitation to a silent auction antiques. They were black market with a capital B. You can return, Messwet, Carlyle said, making me jump. I was glad I had refrained from picking up any of the irreplaceable statuettes or vases. Otherwise, one might have been in pieces on the floor. Thank you. To Dominic, I said, maybe you should ask Neffy to come up and keep you company, if you plan to hang around. My comment earned a bark of laughter from the bedroom. I think not, was Dominic's reply. Go to him. Saga and Sandra will join me here soon enough. I nodded, thanking him silently for releasing me from the guilt of abandoning him. I hurried into the bedroom and shut the door. I expected you to look different, I told Marcus as I crawled toward him on the bed. Locked on me, his irises bled from gold to black in an instant before his eyes narrowed, and he groaned. What? What is it? Does something hurt? I asked frantically, my hands fluttering around him. He squeezed his eyes shut. No, definitely not. Definitely not. Okay. Will you tell me your tale now, or do I have to actually wait until you've consumed all 5 of the agreed-upon meals? I asked as I cuddled against him. After I rest, he said, pulling me closer. With my head laid on his shoulder, I warned, You'd better not back out of our deal. When he didn't respond, I looked up at his face. He was already asleep. Sometime during the next morning, I woke and adjourned to my suite to brush my teeth and shower. When I returned to Marcus's bedroom, he was already awake and sitting up in bed. I gasped when I saw him. Marcus, you look 10 years younger, I exclaimed. He didn't look his usual late 20s or early 30s, but he was getting there. Do I? He asked, unconcerned. Are you going to tell me about the myth now? I settled in the large cushy chair at his bedside, dropping a leather tote stuffed with books and my laptop on the floor. No, he said, smiling mysteriously. I must eat again and then rest. I hope you don't mind. His eyes twinkled. He was toying with me, seeing how far he could push me. We danced that little routine at least a dozen times over the next several days, me asking for the true story behind the myth, him denying me and then eating and falling asleep. I would sit at his bedside and watch him breathe, or I would read or hold quiet discussions with other Negerettes in his sitting room. It was simple and domestic, an easy routine to fall into. On the 5th evening after the shooting, while I was sleeping in my own bed for once, my ba found its way into the ot of its own accord. I was watching 5-year-old me play lackadaisically on the swings in my parents' backyard. A dark-haired and golden-skinned man dressed in a colorful belted robe was approaching the little girl version of me. Turning, he sat on the next swing over, and I inhaled sharply. For a long moment I thought the man was Marcus. He bore a striking resemblance in both coloring and bone structure, but there were subtle differences. Marcus was slightly shorter, making his musculature seem bulkier, and he carried himself differently, more like a modern man. The familiar stranger had an alien grace, his movements too smooth, too quick, too fluid. Who is he? 5-year-old me giggled joyfully, like the tinkling of a dozen bells. You're dressed funny. The man smiled back at her, but said nothing. I knew I was in an echo of something that had happened when I was a little girl, but I would have sworn the interaction I was watching never actually happened. I couldn't remember ever meeting this Marcus look-alike. I'm Alexandra, the little girl version of me announced, her swinging newly enthused. The man who wasn't Marcus inclined his head and repeated in a foreign, ancient accent. Alexandra. It sounded like Alexandra. He pressed the fingertips of his right hand to his chest and said, Nguyen. No way, I exclaimed, my voice hushed. No freaking way! Nguyen, the Great Father, the man who had started our species, visited me when I was a little girl. It wasn't possible. He was supposed to be dead. Like thousands of years dead. Marcus saw him die. Alexandra. At hearing my name, I swiveled my head to the left and found another version of the same man standing only feet away. Shocked, I accosted him with words. You're Nguyen, but everyone thinks you're dead. Can you help us? Can you help me? The prophecy, your prophecy, it must be wrong. Why did you choose me? Nguyen shook his head and said something incomprehensible, his words ancient and alien. I had to remind myself that, despite the resemblance, the man standing beside me was not Marcus.
Nguyen pointed to another part of the yard, a place young me couldn't see. A now familiar and very pissed-off man was lurking behind a tree. It would have been comical, like a scene taken from an old Sunday morning cartoon, but for the identity of the man. Set. "No! He might hurt her!" I exclaimed. I realized the statement was moronic as soon as I voiced it. I hadn't been hurt by Set as a child. In fact, I'd never even seen Set until the first time I entered the Echo in the fertility clinic. Nguyen, ancient and radiating some otherworldly power, raised his hand to touch his first 2 fingers to my forehead. Instantly, I remembered everything. I remembered waking up to find Nguyen sitting in a chair in the corner of my room, watching over me as I slept, protecting me. I remembered catching sight of Nguyen in the distance while I rounded the turn of a slide at the park. I remembered repeating and practicing unfamiliar sounds as Nguyen taught me his language during long, sleepless nights. I remembered Nguyen, dressed in modern clothes, sitting side by side in the bleachers with hundreds of parents and high school students at the homecoming game during my junior year of high school, watching me watch the game. I remembered the feeling of Nguyen's lips pressed gently against mine as tears dried on my cheeks. I had been 16, horribly ashamed that a boy had yet to kiss me, and had just learned that my best friend was dating my crush. I remembered smiling down at Nguyen, who was clapping enthusiastically from the front row at my final ballet performance. I remembered Nguyen holding my hand during the entire 15-hour plane ride from Seattle to Minneapolis to Rome. It had been my first time flying internationally, and I'd been all alone. Thousands of memories bombarded me, exploding into and merging with my own, redefining my identity. In a young, naive way, I had loved Nguyen deeply. I probably always would. I wondered if Nguyen had been the reason that so few boys, or as I grew older, men, had interested me. None could compare, in looks or substance, to the glorious enigma that was Nguyen. My Nguyen. Well, none until Marcus. In his ancient language, a predecessor to Old Egyptian, I asked, "Will you take them away again?" Every time Nguyen visited me, he left by sealing my memories, only to unseal them again on his next visit. "No, my Alexandra," he said sadly, a tear sliding down his chiseled face. "What's wrong?" Without hesitation, I closed the distance between us and wrapped my arms around his neck, standing on tiptoes to bury my face against his collar. "I am weary. I have lived for too long in this body, and my time is coming to an end," Nguyen whispered into my hair. "I have done the best I could, kept you safe from he who would use you, until my grandson, Haru, could take over. He will protect you now." I pulled away and gazed into his color-changing eyes. Remotely, I realized that they resembled the swirling colors in the Aut. "Haru?" I asked, my mind taking longer than usual to register that he was talking about Marcus. Nguyen nodded solemnly. "I hope to see you once more, but I will miss you, my Alexandra," he remarked, kissing me lightly on the forehead. "I don't understand," I admitted. With a humorless laugh, he said, "I know. If everything works out properly, you will understand soon enough. Sooner than you would like." "You're going away, possibly forever," I stated, making sense of his forlorn looks and cryptic words. "That's why I get to keep my memories of you, isn't it?" "Yes." Before I could wallow in the sorrow of losing him, a hidden constant in my life, he asked, "Do you love him?" "Do I love him? Who?" "Haru." I frowned and glanced down at the grass. "I don't know. I think so, but I barely know him." "Oh, my sweet Alexandra, love isn't about knowing. Love is about feeling." I thought about his words and about Marcus. I knew I loved Nguyen, but my feelings for Marcus were different, searingly raw. Nuin had been my comforting, wise companion, while Marcus was rage and intelligence, strength and sex, all wrapped up in an enticing black and gold package. In the past few months, Marcus had made me feel more alive than I had ever felt before. I craved taking the next physical steps with him like a drug addict looking for a more powerful hit. Around Marcus, my emotions were unusually volatile. Anger, lust, joy, and frustration, all waiting eagerly for the chance to explode. So, do I love him? I admit he is young and inconceivably proud and ruthless, but I believe time may temper his rougher qualities. I must pass your care into the hands of another, and there is no better man. Nuin looked around momentarily, as though he could hear something that I couldn't, and briefly smiled. I must leave you now, my Alexandra. I have a guest awaiting my attention. But all will work out. I'm certain of that now. He looked around thoughtfully, and then his gaze sharpened, focusing on me. There are 3 things you must do to survive what's coming. No matter what, do not trust your father. Never say his name in the ought, and keep your younger sister nearby at all times. Jenny? I asked, surprised at the mention of my sister. Why? Not Jenny. But I will see you again, he promised, and kissed me lightly before disappearing. It was the chaste kiss of a cherished friend. Other than a healthy scattering of gentle pecks and a few hotter, heavier kisses at my more needy moments, my relationship with Nuin had been mostly platonic. Nuin was, and would always be, my first love. But those feelings had been grossly eclipsed by more mature, ferocious versions. For Marcus. I watched the past version of Nuin hover protectively around my 5-year-old self for a while, wondering who Nuin could have possibly meant by my younger sister, if not Jenny. Eventually, regular, restful dreams replaced the echo. The following morning, I entered Marcus's bedroom, feeling anxious and a little ill. I had no idea how to tell him about seeing Nuin in the aught, about everything I now remembered. I started to laugh, a shrill, slightly hysterical sound, as I approached Marcus. He was seated at a small, round, ebony table by the window on the left side of his bed, watching me. He looked himself, if still a little thinner than usual. His face was carefully composed, expressionless, but there was a pitiless glint to his eyes. Is he mad about something? Oh God, does he already know about my history with Nuin? How? Stopping behind the chair opposite him, I opened my mouth, then closed it again. How was I supposed to start? With the truth, I told myself. I took a deep breath, then said, Marcus, I think... He held up his hand, stopping my words. Sit, Lex. It wasn't a request. Hands shaking, I pulled out the chair and sat. Seconds passed, and still Marcus simply watched me. I cleared my throat, preparing to try again. He beat me to it. I owe you a story. My story. He looked away, focusing on something beyond the window pane. One of my stories, he said, correcting himself. It's not a happy tale, and I don't enjoy telling it, so you'll have to forgive my shortness. His story? He's going to tell me about him and Set. That's what's putting him in such a bad mood. I almost laughed with relief, but managed to contain myself. I crossed my legs and waited, recalling what I knew of the myth. The contendings of Heru and Set is one of the more well-known Egyptian myths, and like many ancient stories, it sounds a little odd to modern ears. It chronicles the struggle between the two gods to decide who would be Osiris's successor and rule over all of Egypt and her deities. Since some of the gods favored Heru and some favored Set, the two were required to engage in a series of contests. At one point, Heru's mother, Aset, commonly known as Isis, attempted to aid Heru, but she backed out in the end, unwilling to hurt Set. This apparently enraged Heru, and he cut off her head. As punishment, Set gouged out one of Heru's eyes, though another goddess replaced it. The competition between the two gods finally came to a head when Set tricked Heru into having intercourse with him. He believed that if he could prove he had planted his seed inside Heru, the other gods would see him as the dominant of the two and name him as Osiris's successor. Heru, however, was even more clever than the duplicitous Set. You can't make this stuff up. When Set ejaculated, Heru caught his semen and later fed it to him disguised as food. The other gods ruled in favor of Heru as the rightful king of Egypt and her deities, and he became a symbol of the divine right to rule. Finally, Marcus began telling me his version of the myth, the true version. My father, Osiris, ruled the Council of Seven for decades, from Nuen's death until his own, he said in his silk and stone voice. He was the last son of Nuen, so the succession of his throne fell to the grandsons. Set and I were the two oldest and most powerful among them. Most of the council thought I deserved to take over because my father had been the last ruler, but Set and one other member of the council believed he was the rightful successor. He argued that he'd been the patriarch of his line for many years and knew how to lead. I argued that my father had groomed me for the position, and that because of his guidance I already knew everything required of the position. Marcus gave a sad laugh and shook his head. The council ruled in my favor. Unlike in the myth, there were no trials or contests, and I became the rightful ruler of our people. However, 2 days after my coronation, Set approached me, claiming false friendship. He attacked me and gouged my eyes, rendering me blind for a time. He said he wanted me to die slowly, losing my life piece by piece until everything was taken from me, like it had been taken from him. I didn't understand this change in him. I still don't. Before my father's death, we'd been the closest of friends. Sometimes we'd even shared lovers. He watched me, searching for some sort of a reaction. Inside, I felt queasy. Outside, I was granite. We became enemies unlike any the world had ever known. A Set, who was my sister, not my mother, as the mythology claims, found us fighting, or rather, me dying slowly and blind. She launched herself at Set, distracting him long enough for her servants to carry me away. I had loved her dearly for hundreds of years, and he killed her, not me. The myth has that wrong as well. I would never have hurt a Set. I wanted her beside me for eternity. He sighed, deep and heavy with longing. My eyes healed, and I regained my sight the following day, and then I resumed leadership of the Necharat. I moved my court and the council to Hyrcanopolis, and ruled for many peaceful centuries. The humans knew of us in those days and considered us gods for our immortality and abilities to know the past and to predict the future. They worshipped us just as some still believed they should. And that is the truth behind the myth. Marcus fell silent, letting me digest his words. I'm sort of surprised by the accuracy of the myth. Fighting over Osiris's throne, a Set dying, your eyes, I said. Thank you for telling me. He nodded. Sometimes the humans get it right, or mostly right. Though I never understood why they cast Set as my mother. He pondered aloud. Maybe it made her seem a more sympathetic character? I have to tell you something, I blurted, before he distracted me with another tale or before I lost my nerve. Marcus blinked several times, then raised a single arched eyebrow. I took a deep breath. I'm pretty sure Nuen could actually travel through time and not just enter the Aut, I said with one eye squeezed shut and the other barely open to observe his reaction. Pray tell, Lex, what makes you think this? I started to babble. Because he visited me when I was 5 years old, and then again and again, thousands of times as I grew up. He blocked my memories every time he left, so I couldn't recall anything about him when he wasn't there. Obviously, a little bit slipped through, with my obsession with ancient Egypt and all. He taught me his language, which is probably why I'm so good at deciphering ancient texts, and he used to keep me safe from Set when he would come after me, probably trying to kidnap me. I think Set wanted to raise me as his perfect little obedient daughter and not have me grow up to be, well, this, I said, pointing to myself. Anyway, Nguyen visited me in an echo while I was sleeping last night. He released his memory block, and now I remember everything. I fell silent, holding my breath for a long moment before releasing it. Please say something.
This is bad, he said, his voice cold and level.
I'm sorry, I whispered.
No, he said. It's not your fault that Nguyen... Abruptly he laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. God's Lex, you probably know him better than I do. He was never an easy man to know.
I frowned, wondering if we were really talking about the same man. The Nguyen I knew was kind, wise, and gentle.
What's bad, Marcus continued, is what's locked in that temple. Now we know why Set wants the Ankh-At so badly.
His tiger eyes flashed with rage, or possibly fear.
He wants the power to travel through time.
Oh my God, I whispered. Then he could change anything. Thanks for listening to the Read by the Author podcast. To find out what happens next in the story, stay tuned for the next episode. You can also find Echo in Time, as well as the rest of the Echo Trilogy, in ebook, paperback, and professionally narrated audiobook format through all major book retailers, and libraries too. Until next time, happy reading!